Welcome to this lecture on social reconstructionism and critical humanism as a philosophy of education. My reading this lecture is based upon Paulo Freire's philosophy of education as expressed in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, as well as other readings, books. Freire's philosophy of critical humanism, social reconstructionism, also sometimes referred to as critical pedagogy, has a deep connection to liberal humanism and progressivism as philosophies of education. It's connected to liberal humanism and progressivism in the sense that it shares a fundamental purpose with them, that is the liberation of human potential. And critical humanism employs a dialogical, inquiry-based, student-centered approach to education and pedagogy. So there are deep similarities, connections between critical humanism and liberal humanism and progressivism. However, from the perspective of Paulo Freire's philosophy and critical humanism, liberation, the liberation of human potential, requires the transformation of oppressive social structures that impede the full realization of one's humanity, one's innate powers. Liberation from this perspective requires individual empowerment, which in turn requires the development of critical consciousness. And here we have its distinction between liberal humanism and progressivism. Critical humanism puts forth the perspective that the liberation of human potential involves the transformation of society, or the reconstruction of society, and hence social reconstructionism. That is, liberation, the full actualization of human potential, requires a compatible society, compatible political and social and economic structure that is conducive to individual empowerment and individual liberation. Freire, the basic premise of Freire's philosophy is that there's an ontological and historical vocation to become fully human. That is, it's our task as human beings, and as historical beings, to realize our full potential. And that our full humanization is constituted by the liberation, the full actualization of our innate powers. It also can, our being fully humanized can also be conceptualized in terms of the idea of authenticity, which means being for oneself rather than being for another. That is, it's a notion of self-determination and empowerment, that we are, that our innate powers have been actualized and we are free to fully exercise those powers in our life and in society. However, humanization as such and dehumanization are both possibilities inherent in history. And dehumanization is historical, not ontological. That is, it's our ontological vocation to realize our full humanity. But we can be blocked in that realization. Our realization of our full humanity can be impeded by unjust social structures, by an unjust social order. It can be task to become fully human can be stunted, blocked, prevented by structural violence, by injustice in society, and therefore dehumanization, the loss and degradation of our humanity is a historical reality grounded in injustice, not in nature per se. From this perspective, Freire maintains that oppression is equivalent to dehumanization. That is, oppression is interference with our human completion. And he writes in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, page 57, an act is oppressive when it prevents people from being more fully human. On page 55, he writes, any situation in which A objectively exploits B or hinders his and her pursuit of self-affirmation as a responsible person is one of oppression. Such a situation in itself constitutes violence because it interferes with the individual's ontological and historical vocation to become more fully human. With the establishment of a relationship of oppression, violence has already begun. End quote. So, oppression is defined in terms of dehumanization. Oppression is any situation, social situation, historical situation, in which one's humanity is denied, exploited, hindered, impeded through exploitation. And this is violent. It's an act of violence in the sense that it violates our humanity. And oppression is deeply related to the idea of alienation. Oppression as dehumanization is a form of alienation, wherein the oppressed become alienated from their own power, their own agency, their own voice. Oppression is, from Freire's perspective, grounded in what could be called a having orientation. And this having orientation is the predominant perspective of those who oppress others, the oppressor. The oppressor's consciousness is possessive. Freire writes, for them to be is to have, and to be the class of the haves. Humanity is a thing, and they possess it as an exclusive right, as an inherited property. This leads to the objectification and commodification of humanity. The having orientation is based upon the idea, the predisposition, that I am what I have. That is, I identify myself with my possessions. If I have many possessions, then I'm better than someone who has less possessions. There's a problem with the having orientation, because if I am what I have, and if what I have can in principle be lost, because whatever I have can be lost by definition, then I live in a constant state of anxiety, of unhappiness, of deep existential unhappiness, of fear. Because if I lose my possessions, then I've lost myself. If myself is defined by my possessions, if my possessions can be lost, then I live in a state of existential anxiety. And the tendency then is to attempt to moderate and ameliorate this sense of existential anxiety by grasping after more, by collecting more, by possessing more. And that leads, that is not the answer. That does not solve the fundamental ontological problem, existential problem of the having orientation. It only leads to further grasping. So from the perspective of the having orientation, one is caught in a vicious cycle of possession, and that leads to possessing of human beings, of seeing them also as objects to be possessed, as commodities to be consumed. And this is the orientation of the oppressor. The oppressed is consciousness is in response to the having orientation of the oppressor. Those who are oppressed, who have been dehumanized, have been objectified. And a part of oppressed consciousness is objectification. Human beings are seen as objects and begin to see and identify themselves as objects. This results in the loss of the consciousness of themselves as persons, as subjects, and as members of an oppressed social class. So they lose their subjectivity as a person through the process of objectification. They also live with a dual consciousness. They internalize the having orientation of the oppressor. They desire to be free. They maintain their desire to be free, but they're also afraid of their freedom. And the fear of freedom is fundamental to the oppressed consciousness. They want to be free, but they can't be free because they're afraid of being free, because they have internalized the oppressor, the having orientation of the oppressor, the objectification of the oppressor, and have lost themselves in the process. The oppressed become domesticated. Domestication is a feature of the oppressed consciousness. And this is a consciousness of being for another rather than being for oneself. So one begins to view oneself as a means, is viewed and becomes to view oneself as a means for the benefit of others, rather than a autonomous, free, and empowered individual with self-consciousness, with the consciousness of one's own subjectivity as a person. The oppressed also suffer from reification. That is, they become submerged in an oppressed reality, social reality, that is perceived as fixed. There's a tendency to view society, oppressive society, as written into nature, and that the social relations between the oppressor and the oppressed begin to be understood and lived as natural and unchangeable, as fixed, and this is reification. If one begins to view reality as fixed, as reified, then one is caught. It's impossible to change the society. It's just the way things are, and one has to accept one's position in that social order. These oppressive relationships are institutionalized and operate through the institutionalization of false consciousness and disempowerment. And this institutionalization of false consciousness is referred to as ideological hegemony, the domination of certain ruling ideas. Hegemony means domination. And the argument for ideological hegemony runs as follows: that there's a class-conscious elite in society that have control, managing control of the dominant institutions of that society. And this elite class share an ideology. And the idea is the ideology of elites, which serve the interests of elites, are the ruling idea, become the ruling ideas of the social order through the domination of institutions. Through various social institutions, including schools, the ruling ideas of the elite are established as the standard explanation and justification of the social order. And these ideas are portrayed not as the interests, not in terms of the interest of the elite, but they are portrayed in terms of in the interest of all citizens. They serve the interests of the elite. Elite interests are portrayed as the common interest, as commonly valuable to all citizens in the projection of the ideology. However, underneath that projection is the service of the interests of the elite. And the ruling ideas serve to limit discussion and debate, preventing the formation of alternative understandings of society, thus contributing to the general acceptance of the status quo. So the ruling ideas of the elite, the ideology of the elite, become the standard justification for society, and that justification of society is that the society is fair and just, and it works towards the common good. Yet, it does not. The appearance is distinct from the reality. We are told that the society is organized to serve the common good, to serve all the interests of its citizens in a fair and equal basis. However, the institutions do not operate in that way. So ideological hegemony is a kind of mask that hides the true functioning of institutions, and the true purpose of institutions is to serve elite interests. Education is one mechanism that sustains generation after generation ideological hegemony, in particular the banking model of education, where working class kids, underclass students, even middle class students learn about the ruling ideas of the elite as commonly held, and accept those ruling ideas as their own, even though those ideas contradict their fundamental self-interest. The educational task from the perspective of critical humanism and Paulo Freire is liberation and humanization. Education should facilitate the capacity to critically reflect, to participate in critical reflection, to engage in critical reflective participation in their own liberation and that of their oppressors. The task of liberation under conditions of oppression is critical reflective action or praxis, and critical reflective action is purported to lead to the transformation of an unjust social order and the conditions of oppression. The transformation of structural violence is achieved in this philosophy. The hypothesis of this philosophy is that an unjust social order can be transformed if and only if the oppressed and the oppressors acquire a critical consciousness and engage in critical reflective participation in their own liberation. In fact, Freire argues that it is only the oppressed who can liberate themselves and can liberate their oppressors, because the oppressors are also oppressed. They have adopted a having orientation which leads to their fundamental existential unhappiness, which they are attempting to cover up through the acquisition of power and possession. However, so they are, in a sense, also oppressed by themselves. And it is the oppressed who can liberate them as well as themselves. But liberation and full humanization must proceed on the basis of critical reflection and action. Critical reflection meaning that we are able to discern, understand, discern, analyze the relations of power in our society and the functioning of unjust social institutions, and then be empowered to act to transform those social structures. Thus, liberation requires a humanizing pedagogy. As Freire writes, the struggle begins with men's recognition that they have been destroyed. Unquote. Quote, the only effective instrument is a humanizing pedagogy. End quote. The oppressed have been destroyed precisely because their situation has reduced them to things. In order to regain their humanity, they must cease to be things and fight as men and women. This is a radical requirement. They cannot enter the struggle as objects in order to later to become human beings. In order for social transformation in the direction of justice, equality, and liberty to occur, individuals first have to be humanized. The oppressed have to be humanized first before they can enter into the struggle to transform the society. They cannot enter that struggle as objects and be transformed. There's a prerequisite, and that is a humanizing pedagogy. So from Freire's perspective, social transformation, democratic social transformation towards greater justice is based in education. It's based in a particular kind of education, a particular kind of pedagogy, a humanizing pedagogy. And that the transformation of the society must at its core be a pedagogical transformation. From this perspective, what Freire calls the banking model of education, must be abandoned, must be replaced by a humanizing pedagogy. As the banking model of education is in itself dehumanizing, it is in itself oppressive, it is in itself a means to the sustainability of ideological hegemony and injustice in society. The banking model of education is based upon a transmission pedagogy, a narration, or an act of depositing information in the minds of students. That is, the truth is to be transmitted from the teacher to the student, and the student must passively absorb the truth from the teacher, hence banking. The banking model of education portrays knowledge as static and compartmentalized. That is, there's one truth or set of truths, there's one right answer. Students need to know that right answer, and that right answer is transmitted from the teacher to them in a process of depositing. The banking model proceeds on the basis of a teacher-student duality, a contradiction between teacher and student, and a fundamental power relation between teacher and student. The teacher is empowered, the students are disempowered. There is a gap between the teacher and student. They are not co-investigators. They are not co-learners. The teacher is one who knows. The student is the one who is ignorant. And the teacher fills up the student with his or her knowledge. The banking model is an assimilational process. It assimilates students into the current social structure, including oppressive structures. It does not try to reconstruct or question or critically analyze and thereby transform that structure. But the banking model of education is a model of adaptation to the world as it exists. It is based upon a dichotomy between human beings and the world. The banking model views the student as one who is merely in the world, not with the world. That is, it loses its organic and dynamic connection. The student loses her dynamic connection to the world, the social world, and becomes a mere possessor of consciousness, an empty mind that passively receives the world. And this model of education therefore foregoes cognition and replaces cognition, that is, true thinking, authentic thinking, with reception, with receiving cultural artifacts and cultural truths rather than thinking about them. It is mechanistic, it attempts to control thinking, and it inhibits creativity and creative power. Education becomes a mechanical process, an input-output model, a factory model, whereby the raw material is processed in terms of standardized molds. Knowledge is static, it's prepackaged, right answers, the property of the teacher. Knowledge becomes a commodity. That is, that it's something to be possessed and then exchanged in the world. Thereby, knowledge loses its vitality. It loses its component of understanding. Knowledge becomes inert. Ideas become inert. And this all dehumanizes the students. It treats them as objects, not subjects. It does not view the student as a dynamic, experiential, independent, free, and empowered individual, but views the student as an object, as a commodity, as capital. And this is dehumanizing. The alternative that Paulo Freire suggests to us in his philosophy of critical humanism is a critical, problem-posing, dialogical pedagogy. In short, a critical pedagogy. Its aim, its purpose is liberation and empowerment. It seeks authentic thinking and views authentic thought as grounded in communication, in dialogue, in discussion. It focuses on cognition, that is, on authentic thinking rather than on mere reception. At its core, it is problem-posing. Problem-posing in the sense that the pedagogical technique proceeds on the basis of representing taken for granted truths and beliefs and values as problems. It makes problematic taken for granted ideas. For example, once it was thought that Columbus discovered America, and if one believed, and that was a common, and perhaps still is a common point of view, that Columbus discovered America. In a dialogical approach to pedagogy, one would represent or make a representation of that claim and transform that claim into the following statement: that Columbus invaded America. And by problem posing that proposition, then one has made problematic one's history, the history of the Americas in the post-Columbian era. Problem-posing education thereby leads to inquiry. If we have taken a widely accepted belief and questioned it by making it into a problem, then that must lead to further investigation. Okay, did Columbus discover or did he invade America? What were the facts? What was the real situation when Columbus discovered America or wandered onto the Caribbean islands? So, problem-posing education leads to inquiry. It leads to experimentation. It leads to investigation. And that inquiry opens up a dialogue, a discussion, a questioning. And therefore the pedagogy is also dialogical. Through problem-posing and inquiry and dialogue, a critical consciousness can be developed. That is, the student begins to learn how to think, authentically think for herself, and to begin to discern how power and knowledge are interconnected. That there are power relations that are inherent in society and inherent in our ideas and our justifying ideas about how our society works. And through problem posing and inquiry and dialogue, that ideological hegemony can be analyzed, critiqued, and possibly transformed. And this leads to praxis, to critical reflective action. In the critical pedagogy, the teacher-student duality is unified. The teacher becomes the student and the student becomes the teacher in dialogical relationship with each other. That is, the teacher serves as the facilitator of inquiry in the classroom, of problem posing and of dialogue, and engages the students in a range of problem posing activities that lead to inquiry, discussion, and experimentation. Thereby the student begins to appreciate the fact that knowledge is dynamic and interpretive, not fixed, not reified, and not commodified. That the pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of understanding are dynamic processes, and they are contested processes that require inquiry and that require dialogue. One could, in conclusion, one could conceive of the purpose of education from the perspective of critical humanism, or as a sub-purpose of critical humanism, along with liberation and empowerment, is critical literacy. That is, it is through critical literacy that liberation and empowerment can proceed. And critical literacy is reading the word, not only reading the world, but also the capability of reading the world. That is, reading the world is a capability of analytic thinking, of analytic critical thinking, and the discernment of power. The ability to understand and transform relations of power, in particular oppressive relations. That the goal, along with liberation and empowerment, that liberation and empowerment occurs through the development and acquisition of a critical consciousness, a critical literacy among students.